My name's Peter Magee. My family had a business in Mullaney, a general store, and so Caloundra was our obvious sort of holiday resort. It was. My parents, in fact, had holidays here as early back as 1926, staying at King's Boarding House, which of course is where the Pearl Hotel is these days. I think they had a couple of camping holidays in the early 30s here, and obviously decided it would be nice to have a holiday house in Caloundra. So they looked around and built one. I think they started in 1938. They would have bought the land in 1938, just below the lighthouse here. I think it was one of the Tesh. Well, I know it was one of the Tesh family from Laney. One was a builder. The Tesh, not too sure about that, who built the house, and from my memory, and I would have only been 5 or 6 in those days, the house was ready for us to have our first holiday in about 1939. But I do recall, first time I went up I've only been up the old lighthouse twice. One was earlier this week, and I do have a memory, we may have been coming down for the day from Caloundra to see the progress of our new cottage, which was just below this. I must have probably, as a child, said, "Are you allowed to go in the lighthouse?" And Dad said, "Well, we'd have to ask the lighthouse keeper," which he did. It was Mr. Shanahan, of course. And I remember clearly, I think it must have been on our way home. We stopped the car outside, and he went in and knocked on the door, and he came back to the car and said, "We'll have to wait about 20 minutes because Mr. Shanahan was just having his afternoon tea." In fact, what he'd said was something, "I've just put my nose pack on." I remember saying, "What on earth does he mean?" Anyway, that was explained to me, and he kindly took us up to the lighthouse. And it was interesting that my main memory of it, apart from the view, was the collection of shells he had, because he'd been to other light positions before this, and perhaps more Barrier Reef sort of an idea. And what I thought as a child was a fabulous collection of cowrie shells on shells that I now saw the other day. Again, the shells were on.
So which shelves?
Well, there were 2 shelves as you go up.
On the first floor.
Yeah, one. That's where they must have been. So I had my first visit to that. That would have been about 1939 when the house was being built. And then, so here we are in 2014. My second visit.
Right, okay.
But I've seen it for years and years.
Cool.
We built that house, and I showed you photos of it earlier. And I can well remember Mr. Shanahan during the war years walking down for his morning swim. He'd walk straight right by our house through there. We didn't have a fence. My mother would be putting clothes on the line, and he'd say, "Well, they missed us last night, didn't they? And anyway, your house would be the first one to get shot if they were aiming for the lighthouse." It was his little joke. I've got pretty fond memories of the lighthouse from that point of view, and watched with interest its ultimate demise, and this one being built. And of course it went and closed down. I never went in this one until a few days ago. I sort of have always been interested in it.
Right.
But in the 40s, during the war years, we used to sometimes rent an inboard boat from the Red Fleet down at the Palmerstone Channel there, and take the run up as far as the lighthouse reach, and sort of take a picnic lunch and then walk across to the main beach. And the first thing, of course, came to the very tall backlight, which was quite a formidable looking thing. And it had a house there though. There was a lighthouse keeper for it and his family. He had an old, even for those days, a very old car, which they must have used to go across the island, a very rudimentary track across. And we did that. I remember it was pretty hot and uncomfortable. And saw the other little light that was right out the front, and had some company with a conversation that spoke to the lighthouse keeper at the time. I presume it was the Goslings. And and I think from memory my mother by this time had developed a headache and she couldn't have to get a Beck's powder or something like that there. But following on that, one of the things we sort of did every few years was go for a walk, and then we used to walk down and look at the old forts after them. By sort of the 1950s, that was they were still very visible, though ultimately they've sort of almost fallen into the sea the last time I was up there, which is a few years now. But around about 1960 I was holidaying here. By that time my family had sold the house down there below the lighthouse, and we were thinking about building. We didn't do it at that stage, but we were holidaying up on sort of above the pavilion area there, and I took a boat and went up on my own, I think, from memory, and noticed that by this time that all the lights were in a great state of disrepair, and that got me interested in what had happened to them and why they weren't being used. And someone told me that the lighthouse keeper's family, one of them, still lived in Caloundra, and this was the Goslings, and I tracked them down, and they were kind enough to loan me several of their big logbooks, and which I took back to Brisbane and photocopied various pages, ultimately gave them back to them. That was all in about 1960, and they told me various stories of what life was like and what it was like during the war there. I remember one time, I think it was the wife, Mrs. Gosling, said they were very scared on one occasion. Very, very high tide. They were up at the front line. Very big high tide sort of came in and flooded all the area around their house. They were quite concerned. I remember she sort of said, we felt like we were going to be rats in the drain almost. But no great harm apparently was done. So that's basically how I got interested in the lighthouses. Later on, I mentioned earlier that my father had a business, a general store in Delaney, which he sold in 1945. And we continued to come to the beach house. In fact, when he sold there, that was at the end of the war in 1945, the family moved down to this house. Temporarily, we were virtually on our way back to Brisbane. They were Brisbane people, my parents. And I spent the last 3 months of 1945 going to the Caloundra school. In my class, and I only heard by Trevor a few days ago that Des Dwyer had died. He was in my class at the Caloundra school, as was people like Oral, Barker, Gene Barker from the pharmacy, who was there. So that sort of added to my history of Caloundra, if you like.
No, we live in Bribie.
And then from then on, it was periodic visits, and finally we decided to build the house at Dicky Beach. By that time, the Goslings were kind enough to loan me, I can't remember whether it was all the logbooks now, but certainly at least 3 logbooks of their days in Bribie, which they still have. They were told to stop lighting because of the war at certain times, and they were in constant connection with the garrison, as it was called over there. Called Powell, in my memory. Does that ring?
That's right, yeah.
Yes. He was also a librarian. There was a news agency just at the end where we meet Bulcock Street down here. Just as you turn right, you go down the street on the immediate left. The building is still there, where it was a news agency. I think his daughter ran that news agency, and he used to make regular visits up here to just see all was well, I think. If Caloundra had a lighthouse keeper during those days, that was he. Remember when we built that house in 3839, it was always, we had kerosene lights and such like a wood stove, but power did come to Caloundra before the war, or the very early days of the war, certainly around about 1940, as it did in Maleny too. And so we switched to electricity around about that time. And I can remember the revolving light that started then compared to the fixed light that when I was taken through. I had this on the wall, and they gave this to me. Some boys who must have got lost. If the boys arrive here while we're away, who are missing from Bribie Island, from Bribie Township, please phone the Bribie postmaster. The phone's in near the wireless, leaving doors unlocked, so you'll be able to go in and use say, we'll be back this afternoon, Gosling, lightkeeper. And the boys must have found it, because down here it's got, thanks very much for all you've done to help us.
And you said that was out of the 1930s?
That would have been in the 1930s, I believe. It's not dated. They'd kept it because it was fairly significant. It wasn't often they got. Here's something from 1950, 1812, 144-gallon drum of kerosene from the Department of. I suppose they had to sign for things when they can't. This goes back to 1896. This is a list of all the equipment received: 1 oil drum, 2 oil measures, 1 oil can, 2 buckets, right down to the stationery, 1 barometer, 1 thermometer, spirit level, pair of binoculars, Bribie on front light, number 10.
Right.
Where number 10 is today. That's me on the bike there with my sister. And that would have been around about, I look like I'm about 5 or something like that. So it'd be about 45. No, it wouldn't be. I was born in 33. So I would have been older than that. She was born in 38. But this is where Mr. Shanahan used to come down, come past the house and say, we missed out on, last night, better luck next time, sort of thing. These photos of the Dicky, because they're very, I'd love to know why they've never been able to, find out more. I think it's just because the family don't want to give them up, And that, of course, is the old photo of a very early photo of the Queen of the Colonies, I guess taken in the 1930s. I can remember going down below it, certainly in perhaps the 1950s, and it still stood out as a notable tree even then, and obviously that's why they picked it to carve. And that was from that ceremony when the Women's Historical Ladies group, they had those blue plaques. They were the people who organised the excavation of the propeller, and it was at that ceremony where the particular councillor, I just forget who it was there, and so they must have brought the bell for the event. The Hendersons was the name of the family who had it, and they had a place just along from Governor's Row, where Sir Leslie Wilson had his home, of course, perhaps it was their proximity to it all that somehow where they lived, it wouldn't have been built. It was built around about 37, 38 when the Governor's place was put there. The Sacks were also there too, and Saxon.
Oh, okay.
In fact, there was always a bit of argument that the Sacks family claimed that they had the block. They were the first to build on the that estate. And they were immediately followed by the Governor. They bought 1 block, whereas I think the Governor ended up with about 7 blocks.